off. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you here in our last session of the year with Catalyst 2030's Learning Series. We'd love to have you put in the chat who you are, your organization, where you're coming in from, and if there's something you're looking forward to in this session. We'd love to hear that as well. If you are able to put that in the chat, and as you have time, we'd love to hear from each of you and saying your greetings to our speakers today, because we are thrilled to have both of them. I'm going to pass it off to our moderator today, Cheri-Leigh with Erasmus, and allow you to kick us off. But thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to the wonderful team at Catalyst 2030 for putting together this session. It's a great honor and privilege and delight to be here with you today. I'm Cheri-Leigh Erasmus. I'm co-CEO of Accountability Lab, and I'm joining you quite not early, but it's 9 a.m. in the morning. So good afternoon and good evening to those of you joining us from other spaces. With me today as a co-presenter, I have Peter Metsopoulos from the Center for Theory of Change, an organization that has deep knowledge on this exact issue we're talking about. So I'm delighted to have Peter with us as well today. First, to get us started, I would love to hear from you in the chat. Two things I'd like to hear. What does change mean to you in your organization? What is the change you're trying to create? So it could be even one word. When we talk about the word change, what comes to mind for you? For me, when I think of change, I think of momentum. What is the word for you? So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to drop a couple of ideas or words, connections of what change means for you in the chat. I see it means influence, it means inclusion, gradual transformation. I love this, flexibility and adaptability, forward, yes, interconnectedness, adaptability, growth. Wonderful. I can see that you are people who think about change and you're committed to it and you have a sense of what it means for you. I want to do one more thing to get us started. Since today we're talking about theories of change, I'd like you to use the hand raising or just even the thumbs up option that you have on Zoom to let us know who's joining us today has a theory of change in your organization, just to give us a sense of where you are. So if you have a theory of change, please give us a thumbs up or use the raise your hand button so we can see. Great, so I see a couple of thumbs up. Great. But it looks to me like the majority on the whole, Peter, are coming from organizations where people are still potentially working on developing a theory of change, which is great for us to know as we dive into today's session. So thank you so much for giving us a sense of where you are. With that, I'm really excited for us to dive into today's session. So I'm going to hand over to Peter to get us started.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Cheri-Leigh. And thanks so much to Catalyst for having us here and organizing all of this work. What I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to move through at a fair clip just to give you a sense of the wholeness of theory of change, so that we can have a robust discussion and exchange of ideas. For those of you who already have theories of change, some of this will obviously be some review, but I think that everyone will find it to be useful material. So I am going to go ahead and share. Fantastic. Okay. So I'm Peter Metsopoulos. I'm the executive director for the Center for Theory of Change, which is a nonprofit that was founded by practitioners and professionals in the field as a means of propagating the best practices for creating theories of change. Because we want to make the world a better place. That's why we're here together. And when we talk about, and that includes a kind of global footprint for us because we do trainings, we also do a certification course for theory of change. And so that allows us to have a network of people who we are in touch with around the globe, always looking to expand. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, for anyone who wants to contact us to talk about ways to partner and things we can talk about. When we talk about change, we are talking about creating something that has not existed before as a means of making a difference, of making the world a better place. And we should not fool ourselves that that is hard work. Sometimes I think that we imagine, because the visioning can be so inspirational and in a way easy, that the change itself, if it's so hard, we must be doing it wrong. And I have come to realize that that is not true at all. If it's hard, we're probably doing it right because we are doing it in a rigorous and thoughtful way. We're doing it in a way that we believe will bring the results that we want in a logical way that also is collaborative, so that it is, as people were saying, inclusive and a win-win for everyone. And so we want to do that, again, for both the people who are making the change, but also the people that we are communicating that change to, whether that be people who are coming on board in the work, or people who we're communicating with in terms of funding or building coalitions. So in order to get to that point of results and collaboration, we have all of these needs, right? Critical thinking, a range of perspectives, being explicit about the underlying assumptions that are going to lead to specific outcomes. So what is theory of change? Well, it is a representation of how and why a complex change process will succeed under specific circumstances, right? If we're striving to create change, we should always be able to explain how it is that it's going to happen. We shouldn't just say, well, we're feeling like this is a good way to go. We can be doing a lot of good work and still not have kind of the most effective way forward to that larger goal, that larger outcome, and making that vision a reality. To look at it from a utility standpoint, often we'll be asked, what use is a theory of change? Many. It serves as a roadmap for the people who are getting there. It serves as a point of agreement in terms of partners that are going to come on board because we don't do this work alone, ever. It serves as your framework for implementation, and I think even more importantly, because a TOC is a living document, it serves as a point for continual check-ins, evolutions, and evaluations. What makes it different in some ways from other approaches is that you're working backwards, right? You're starting with that vision, which is amazing. And then you are bringing other voices into the room to help you figure out, how do we get there? What are the challenges? What are the resources? And keeping that living conversation going on so that as you work from the bottom up, once you're done, you can say, are we doing what we need to? Fantastic. We're on track, keep going. And if not, what do we need to shift? How do we explain and implement in a way that makes it real? You'll see that what we have is this sense of moving forward together as a means of participatory exploration and documentation. It's done on Post-its most often because it is evolving even within a 1 week training or a 1 week exploration, because that 1 week is only going to be the beginning. And as we work through that, these advantages become clear as we surface the assumptions that we're working with. And if they hold true, fantastic. And if they do not, we need to rethink that. And that is not a failure, it is a success of the methodology. So we want to always keep in mind that that evolutionary process is evidence that we are doing the work in the right way to actually make things happen in the real world. Okay, those are larger pictures. So what I want to emphasize here is the people in the room. We worked with the UN in the Philippines, and we had 3 different groups circling around 3 different pathways that they were working on as a means of getting both expertise and outside perspective. So let's talk about, kind of the actual components that go into a theory of change. We're going to walk through each one of these briefly, but there are really 6 steps, I'll call them, as if it were only linear. It's easier in a brief way to think of them as linear, but of course they are evolutionary and iterative. Right, you are working primarily at first in a visual way. You're mapping pathways, right? This looks linear and overly simplistic, but this is the building block, right? Now note that the blue is an outcome, and we would call the red ones preconditions. But of course, every precondition was an outcome to what came before it. As we move forward, each of those should feel like we have reached a state of being that enables us to then think about what action is needed next to get to the next outcome. As you can see, the outcomes are across the top of that board as a means of working from the ground up, which is how we work. And that allows us to keep those goals in mind, to make decisions based on those outcomes that we want to see and all the assumptions we know go into them. The question often comes up, are there differences when we talk about outcomes and impacts and goals and aims and results? And our feeling is that outcomes is the right word. It's the one we find is used most often, but there is no single set of language that is, has to be used. It's really about consistency and clarity, both in your own work and to the people to whom you are talking. The one thing I would point out, sometimes people bring in the word output, which to us is a kind of some kind of reportage, a report, an evaluation, a white paper that comes out of the process. All of the rest of these pieces, all of the rest of these labels to us signify the same thing. So step 1 is about outcomes. We have this long-term vision, and then we are working to below what we call the line of accountability, where we begin to measure things into well-defined outcomes, right? So if your vision is a world that is healthier, wealthier, and wiser, you might choose some of these outcomes as ways that are measurable, that you could say you are getting to that. They're not the only ways, of course. Visions have many ways of being fulfilled, but your ultimate outcome, your long-term outcome, is the place where you are beginning to define what it is that you are striving toward. Then you are building those pathways that we talked about, and that tells you where you want to go, your blue long-term outcome, the route that you're going to take to get there, which are those interventions, the actions, which are represented by those arrows that get you from one state of being to another. And those preconditions are the milestones. Now, then you're going to identify your assumptions. Of course, there are assumptions, but you want to be intentional about naming them, because That way, you are not surprised if you come up against a situation where your assumption turned out to be wrong. So that if you were thinking that you were going to disseminate information in the US through meetings at public libraries, you could make an assumption that most communities are going to have public libraries. That may not be true in every country, and it may not even be true in every locality in the US, but it is an assumption we might make, and we would want to name it so that if we came up against a different situation, we would know, okay, so that turned out to not be correct. We need to adjust for it. Then your rationales are your explanations for why an action is going to lead to an outcome, right? And so those give context to why it is that your theory has a logic to it. The ways that we measure are through indicators of success, right? These are our evidence. What does it look like if the outcome is met? So the example here, if you're talking about students being ready for middle school, it may be 5th or 6th grade reading scores. Note that for every indicator, there are kind of 5 facets that we look at. You'll see them listed here. And actually on the left-hand side, you'll actually see from our computer program, we created Theory of Change Online that actually makes it easy to map particularly theories of change. And you know, that's been around for a while, and you know, now people often use whiteboards and those Miro and Mural. Those also work, but don't have some of the bells and whistles that are particularly attuned to theory of change. So we go from, you know, kind of this massive work of mapping out what we believe in our expertise to usually to a computerized version for the purposes of being able to communicate and iterate. And then you'll start to see that the visual language here becomes clearer. Now, that's a good sign. You don't have to be able to read the type here. I specifically made it really small so you couldn't, because I wanted you to see that visual language, that visual logic that allows you to communicate, again, both within and without the project, because it takes a massive village of workers and thinkers and planners and project managers and funders who are going to be looking at this. Even as things get more kind of academic, if you will, there is still a logic here that we can look at and begin to understand. Even this one, which feels overwhelming at first, has a kind of map to it, so that we can see the pieces as they're explained to us by the people who would own that. The last piece, once you have that logic, you're going to write a narrative. This becomes the basis for your elevator pitch. It becomes a basis for proposals for grants. It becomes part of what it is that you are living and breathing. And if you are having trouble doing the narrative, right, it means we need to go back. We need to think about what our logic is so that we can easily and completely understand and explain. Last piece, and I wanted to put this in part because we're going to be looking at theories of change, and it's a good thing to keep in mind. This is often a theory of change as a communicative tool, and the scope that you choose to present it in is usually one of 4 ways, each with its own purpose, right? So we always say, do the deep and broad version, flesh it out fully as much as you can for the project, because you want all of that detail. But then as you talk to, say, someone who is coming in just for one of those precondition or outcome pathways, they probably only need to know, especially at the beginning, the details about those top line pieces and then the depth where they are going to be working. That may also, if you're looking at narrow and shallow, maybe, say, for a funder who is funding that and doesn't need to know every step, might become overwhelmed by every step and needs to know the very specifics of where those pieces are. The broad and shallow becomes for general funders who are going to be looking at the whole project as a kind of cohesive piece. And now I'm going to hand it over to Cheri-Leigh.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was actually just, I want to say, a great refresher, even for those of us who have worked with theories of change for a very long time. So I couldn't appreciate that more. Great. I'm going to just hand over to, I think, Komi, who'll be managing the slides. Whenever you're ready, you can flick over to the next slide. Let me maybe start briefly with an introduction to Accountability Lab, just to give you some context of where I'm coming from. So at Accountability Lab, we work as 11 separate what we call labs across the world, primarily, as you would see on the screen, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. I work at Accountability Lab Global, which is based in DC. Our organization works as a network because each of these entities you see on the screen are a separate legal entity, but we share a strategy, we weave our learning together to iterate and do our work in a way that's more impactful, and we share a strategy ultimately. So when we think through things like our theory of change, it is a collective participatory process where people from all of these teams that you see listed on the screen participate in revising our theory of change when we do that every couple of years. At our core, at Accountability Lab, we work on issues related to governance and accountability. So to sum our work up, in 5 seconds, ultimately everything we do is aimed at better enabling communities or citizens to hold their governments accountable for issues related to governance. And we aspire to see a world where citizens are active, leaders are responsible, and institutions are accountable. I won't keep you too long, but the website for our work is in the chat, so feel free to connect with me or find out a little bit more. You can switch the slide, Komi. Great. I also won't dive into our programs much, but essentially we have 3 buckets of work. We work on public-facing campaigns to get people more engaged in governance. We work on knowledge building to find and equip people inside and outside government to build their knowledge around how they can push for reforms in government. And then we work at the community level, gathering citizen-generated data to feed what people are feeling and experiencing around issues of service delivery, access to justice, and other governance issues into national level policymaking processes to help communities solve problems. Great, let's dive into our theories of change. So I put together on the following slides a couple of theories of change that Accountability Lab has had over the last 4 years. To give you a sense of, over the last couple of years, sorry, to give you a sense of how as an organization, we've really embraced 2 things. One is iteration, and I cannot stress this enough. Peter mentioned that almost that interplay between finalizing or coming up with a good draft for your theory of change and then getting to the point where you're writing your narrative and realizing, oh, we struggle to explain this thing as well as we thought we could. And that actually prompting you to go back and see, like, is there a missing link there? Or is there an assumption or some kind of causality that we haven't thoroughly unpacked? Because if you're unable to really explain it to people, then there's something wrong, right? And so over the years, we've gone back and forth through a very iterative process in between every time we create a new theory of change, but also in improving it as we go along. We also have usually multiple sets of theories of change, if you think about it, because you do the very long process of getting people together with the sticky notes, unpacking everything, but that might not be what we put out into the world. And that brings me to my second point. Over the last few years, we've gotten better at focusing on building ownership around our theory of change. because what we found is having a very complex theory of change, like the one that I've put on the screen here from 2016 as sort of the external facing document that's seen by our community, our participants, and everyone who works in our organization. It might be hard to get them to buy into it if they don't necessarily understand the very deep, very wordy document. So what we've done, and maybe you can flip to the next one, Komi, is over the years, we've tried to simplify what we put as our more external facing theory of change so that everyone in our organization and our community around us are better equipped to understand our theory of change and buy into it and make it part of their engagement with us or part of their work if you're in the organization. So in the 3 years between 2016 and 2019, we flipped to making it something that's slightly more visual, using the iconography, for example. And again, there's a much deeper document in the background that is not public facing. But this helped us to really have even junior members of our staff have more buy-in into it and sort of in a very linear manner explain what we're trying to do and what we're trying to get to. You can flip again, Komi. Then in 2020, we actually entered a new cycle for our strategic planning. And what we decided to do there was, again, it's withered down even more into words that people can use to talk about our work outside. But we also made a change here to start calling it in our organization to refer to a theory of action. And these two things are not interchangeable. It doesn't mean the same things. It's that we recognize that in the governance ecosystem where we work, there is a very large theory of change of what needs to happen to shift things in a positive direction for citizens, for more accountable governments. However, at Accountability Lab, we contribute a slither of work to what's needed for that broader change in the ecosystem. And so ultimately, we went down to creating a theory of action that describes the actions we take as an organization, as a single entity in an ecosystem to contribute to this much larger change that is needed. And again, we found that this made much more sense for where we are as an organization and to ensure that people in our organization and around us understand and are able to buy into it. I'm going to flip one more time to where we are today with our theory of action. Again, we tried to make it way more engaging visually for people who work with us. We work often with hyper-local communities. We work with much smaller, locally led organizations who are our partners and really important to our work. And we wanted people to be able to connect to it. So in cutting back on some of the jargon that we were using in earlier models of our theory of change, and I saw, Peter, just to reference that you, at some point in your slide, said the jargon doesn't matter as long as you're consistent in how you talk about what you do. So we decided to actually talk more around, link our work around questions. So what do we bring, right? Have people understand that this is the value we're adding as an organization, how we work as a means to unpack our approach to program implementation, the activities, and then leading that to what we do. What are the actual activities that we do, to the buckets of work that are relevant for us? What is the change we envision? So having people answer those questions also in our specific setup for an organization is really relevant, because ultimately the change we envision stays the same across our network, but the what we do, for example, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, might look slightly differently in Nigeria than what it looks like in Pakistan. However, if people understand these headings and the broad questions we're trying to answer, we found that people are more able to connect with this. Having a theory of action has been incredibly important to us. And it's been important that it doesn't just speak to our donors and the, sort of the high level people out there, others in the development sector who speak the same language as us. But it's enabled us to help embed this in our organization as something that also prevents, in a way, mission creep. We're all in a development sector where it can be tempting to start doing things that aren't entirely aligned with the change you're trying to create, because we are all also out here seeking funding, seeking resources. And what we found is our theory of change, the fact that everyone in our organization is able to connect to it and understand it, helps prevent that urge to go off track with what we're trying to do, because it needs to fit in under these questions we're trying to answer. And if an activity or a pot of funding doesn't fit there, then there's a problem, right? Then we're potentially going into the realm of mission creep. So this is a very, very brief overview of our approach to theories of action. And I would love to hear from others your questions. So please feel free to drop those in the chat. And I know we have some time later on to talk through and answer some of those questions. I think I'm going to hand it back to Komi. Are we going back to you?
Yeah, so we would like to showcase encompass education to showcase your theory of change for everybody feedback. So please go ahead, Gitanjali. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Peter and Cheri-Leigh, for sharing. I'm finding a lot of inspiration from your talks. I'm sharing a theory of change from the organization I'm the education program manager for, called Compass Education. We are a nonprofit that empowers educators in schools with systems thinking tools to help prepare our students and each other to build a more sustainable world. So I'm realizing as I listen to these presentations, I have a very brief 2 things to show you. One is this very simple feedback loop that we use to try and explain our theory of change during like workshops and presentations. We basically believe that the more educators teaching systems thinking mindsets and tools in the world, the more students will be equipped to go out in the world and tackle complex problems for sustainability, which will lead to more action, which will lead to more educators doing work. And we see ourselves as in there increasing that educator capacity. And then on the back end, we have something a bit more complex. I don't expect you to be able to read the whole thing, obviously, but we're trying to think about how we have our inputs, what we're doing for activities, and our organization is actually thinking about what we're looking for. We're trying to rethink our strategy a little bit to find out how we can better communicate the work we do to others. So we have these outputs of educators being more confident, being able to use systems thinking tools, making lesson plans with them that are integrated into their curriculum. And we expect it to come up with all sorts of outcomes. And ultimately, we want students, educators, and school communities to be part of building a more sustainable world. So I'm super curious for general feedback on how this communicates to you, but also advice on how we can engage our network of 60 facilitators in our team in reimagining our theory of change to help like really think about what we're focusing on, how we communicate it to people, or any other feedback. Should I leave the slides up for some feedback, I guess?
Yeah,
questions, ideas?
and actually, I think, Peter, this is great for you to give feedback because a lot of us go to the logic frames as well. So go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that I love that you have like a communication tool, right, for the broader sensibility, right? And it goes a little bit to what Cheri-Leigh was talking about with in terms of theories of action. You know, what gets it across in some ways is the key there.
Hopefully.
And right, exactly. And you can only know that by doing some, kind of focus groups, or asking the people that you're hoping to explain this to what they're seeing. So I think that's great, and this is really engaging in the sense of a movement forward and the fact of iteration, right? Like none of this happens in a single go round. I wish it were so. I'm sure you do as well.
Me too.
It's interesting that Compass Education is a little off to the side. I would love to talk with you about that further. I find that intriguing. But if you go back to the full-fledged theory, right? I think it's interesting to think about the different. You have like three main pathways here.
Yeah.
I'm simplifying, but that can be a way to talk, to have people give input, because, right, it's easier to focus on a single pathway than it is to take it all in at once and say, what do you see? So that you can
Sure.
arrange people again, kind of maybe in terms of their expertise, and then in terms of something that they're not expert in, so that they can say, I'm not following you here. How does that work? How does that follow? So that presses us, right, to say, oh, I thought that was clear. It's totally clear to me, right? And that's the great part about the collaboration, right? Is we get that, and then I can imagine from those groups kind of bringing people together. If it's possible to do it with everybody, great, but sometimes that's unwieldy. With representatives from each of those three to kind of talk about where they cross and how that would look. And then, of course, right, you want to populate those arrows at some point with your interventions, right? What are your interventions and your indicators? What are the assumptions that are being made, and the rationales for how you built that? Right. And for all I know, you have all of those things, and it's almost impossible to show the entire thing, right? You saw those monster post-it note
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But using either something like Theory of Change Online, or a whiteboard program where you can have kind of like drop downs, right, that actually appear as you press on them, or even key graphs, or key I'm sorry, I'm losing my language, tables, so that they're keyed to A1 on one of the arrows becomes a table down at the bottom of that graph. But that's obviously not something that you're going to present. Right. This is something that is clearly meant to draw people into your way of thinking, not to prove to them that everything works. So I would say that's part of what of what we all wrestle with, is where are we with what I'm showing you here, and that's why we really push everyone to do all of the work, the exhaustive version of what you've got, because then you can start to pare back. And when someone like me comes along and says, where are your interventions? You can say, oh, they're right over here. We just didn't want to overwhelm you.
That's really helpful feedback for many reasons, but I think for our organization, we're a tiny, tiny nonprofit team with a big network. So we haven't done like the huge big picture work. We just tried to communicate what we're doing. And I'm hearing the importance of the process, which makes perfect sense in coming back to this point and not just starting with something simple.
Yeah, well, and partner work, right? When we worked with the UN in the Philippines, right? That group was probably about 40 people. They're only a convener, right? They don't have any power beyond that. Then that's an incredibly powerful power, but they would do their work through partners. And so the second half of what we did was a partner, a stakeholder convening, where they presented their draft theory of change and invited input, so that their partners were full partners in the thinking and so in the execution, right? So that if we were working on women's reproductive health, the hospitals had something to say about what it would mean for them to be able to have that kind of staffing, and what it would mean for them to be able to culturally navigate a country that is both strongly Catholic with a strong Muslim majority region, right? Two different strong cultural and religious forces within that society. So those are actually those partners are your best allies in this work, and this work is a way to draw them in even closer.
I love that. And I think you both kind of spoke to this, the idea of like who in your community or your team needs to be involved. So I love the idea of like, we have our core team, we have a big network of facilitators who do our work, we have lots of other stakeholders that like we engage, and then we do have partnership. And that's actually not really reflected in our theory of change right now, like how we're trying to work with partners. But I hear a real opportunity to have a meaningful collaborative conversation about how we can work together and maybe where our theories of change intersect a little bit as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
great.
Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you for sharing. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
We like giving those examples. So we wanted to bring in Peter and Cheri together just for a little bit of a Q&A conversation. If you're able to be on camera, that's great. Feel free, if you have questions, to put them in the chat as well. But I want to kick off first, Peter, because I wanted you to take the time to kind of talk a little bit about those, how are logic models used differently around the world, and how does the theory of change and the log frame, because it's kind of everybody sees it as different things, and we'll use theory of change as the term, but you can explain that a little bit clearer. That would be wonderful.
Well, I actually wanted to say, Cheri-Leigh, you looked like you wanted to
Oh, sorry.
respond.
Sorry. Go for it.
That's good.
You know, I wanted to say one thing to Jithandli quickly, and that was that I think, you know, sometimes as a small organization, we don't always have the resources to even bring so many people together to provide input, whether it's partners or even like I think funders who could have interesting ideas around how they've seen our work make an impact, or people affected by our work directly. So one thing we've tried to do over the last few cycles, once we have a draft ready, you know, send that out as part of a survey to people to get their feedback, and that way you can get like a couple of hundred people to respond and see whether it resonates with them. One way to do that at a even a more useful way than just sending out a whole draft theory of change is potentially breaking it up into those verticals, right? And sending pieces to people who have specific interest in or experience in working with you on a specific area of work, because then you can get more deep and meaningful feedback from a subset of partners, for example. So I would encourage you to think about that too. Sometimes you can't have everyone in the room, but once you have sort of like a collaborative process and you have a draft, like who else can you by survey?
Thank you for that very much.
What she said. All right. So I'm actually going to share my screen because I actually do have a slide that addresses the kind of other approaches. So, you know, the broad umbrella here is results-based management. Right, and there are a lot of ways to do it. You can see here, right, there are, you know, we believe, right, that with each of these, there is a way that theory of change is adding, has an additive quality, right? So log frames and logic models are mostly not explanatory. Now, that's, again, you get into a kind of zone of jargon, right? Some people will look at a theory of change and say, oh, it's a log frame. Right, and okay, if you want to call it that, but we actually built out all of these other pieces. So I think, you know, the key is just to, you know, in some ways I always want to ask them, when you say log frame, can you show me what you mean, so that we're talking about the same thing, because often, you know, we're working across both methodological and also cultural differences. And so, I will tell you my secret is that I hadn't even heard of theory of change until 2020. So I was an educator and came from the K through 12 world. And when I crossed paths with Helene and had my road to Damascus moment, I realized that what we call backwards design was basically theory of change, right? And I see Gitanjali nodding, right? So there's another way of looking at it, right? So there are all these names for what we do, and that's kind of what I would say to that, rather than walking through what each of them is, just to make a clear distinction or identification even, right? Like, let's assume that, we're all talking about the same stuff. Make a clear identification of what it is that we're talking about with the elements that are going to be part of it, so that you are going into a process where someone understands that you're going to be talking about interventions and assumptions and indicators and rationales. That helps a lot and will often set people at ease, right? So that if your partners are concerned about whether you really understand the world in which they work, they will often be set at ease by saying, tell me some of the things that I don't know. Tell me some of the ways that we make assumptions that may not hold true in the work that you see that we're doing.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think that's good. Cheri, I loved your visual examples and being able to communicate this. Can you share a little bit about how communications plays such a critical role in communicating the work that we're doing?
Yeah, I cannot stress it enough. So when I joined Accountability Lab, we were this is about 7 years ago at this point, we're still very much a startup. So we had program implementers that point in time, and many of you on this call would probably understand this too, there wasn't a whole lot of resources for learning people and dedicated comms people. And it was really in maybe the 18 months after that we were able to stand up a learning team and a communications team. And what we learned really quickly on was that these two things need to work hand in hand, because I always say to people, if you're doing something and you're not able to communicate it well, in the development world, it's almost as if it didn't happen in a way, right? Because again, that fostering buy-in, having people own what you're doing, the successes, but also learning from what's not going well, that can only happen if you're communicating it. And so we actually have very strong cohesion between people learning from our work. So those collecting data, those using our theory of action to go back and our indicators to actually measure whether we have success, making sure that gets fed back to our comms team so that they can communicate about this internally and externally. The visuals became really important to us because our organization actually works with a lot of young people too. And if we want them to understand what we're trying to do when we're asking them to participate in programs, we need to be able to speak to them. And it's also a principles matter, right? People who participate in our programs, we don't see them as beneficiaries. They are partners in our work. And therefore, we want them to be able to buy in and feel spoken to directly. And if we work with younger people in marginalized communities, using really high level jargon just is not going to necessarily speak to them. So all of this to us comes back to meeting people where they are and seeing them as our partners in everything we do.
I absolutely love that. And I put that in the chat about we're working with our clients or our partners. You're not a beneficiary of our service. It's too condescending. We're in this together type mentality. So let's ask another question I wanted to ask is that one of the biggest challenges in developing a theory of change is ensuring that these outcomes I can measure them and they're realistic. Can you give some tips or advice on that?
I'm happy to jump in first.
Mhm.
So for us, and again, this is kind of this difference between when are you working with a theory of change or theory of action and a logic model. But let's talk about like outcomes more broadly. It's really important that once you've nailed down what it is you're doing, what your contributions are, that you immediately start creating indicators. So what is success in something going to look like for you? And it's not about creating the most complex of indicators, but again, something that is understandable so that everyone in the team can also take ownership of monitoring and measuring. And it's about making these indicators measurable. So having a clear target, being clear about who we are affecting. And the more clear you can become in your indicators, the less complex, I think, the more ownership there will also be to actually measuring whether we're making them. Because I've also been in spaces where organizations have really complex indicators for everything. Half of them are immeasurable, and the other half, the people in the organization don't quite understand what we're working towards here because the targets are not even clear. And so again, simplification is incredibly important when we work on indicators.
Yeah, I would add just a couple of points. One is that especially for small nonprofits, small efforts, to choose things that are already being measured. Right, so that if you are measuring reading scores, you don't have to measure that. That's already being measured, and you have a backdated history that you can look at that is publicly available, and that is already the measurement by which society judges the situation that you're looking at. So that takes a whole bunch of work off of your plate. And when you're either just starting or you continue to be a small nonprofit doing the great work that small nonprofits do, that's incredibly helpful. The other thing I think is to match those with the measurements that makes sense in terms of the change that you're trying to create, because a lot of times that new change, right, which is a kind of oxymoron of its own, nobody has thought to measure that yet. Right, and so if you're looking at a school, I'll stay in the school realm. If you're looking at not just reading scores, but the progress that has been made in terms of internal to the school progress, from when kids started to when kids ended where kids ended the year, a lot of times that's not collected by the school district. But it is important in terms of how you're building structures within the school, both in terms of the understanding of the kids and in terms of the understanding of the program. So I think a mix of both of those things, and to Cheri-Leigh's point, something that is really clear, that every stakeholder understands.
Great. And one last kind of question from the audience, and then we'll wrap this up. One of our members, which I apologize, I cannot pronounce her name. She's leader of a community development service that's under the government, and it's been a challenge to get people interested in these activities. How do you employ the theory of change to influence people that are uninterested and unmotivated in making a difference? And remember, she's working with a government agency.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I cross paths in my work with government agencies too. And this type of thinking in some bureaucracies or in some spaces are just not necessarily, it's not people's first instinct to look at things this way. What I found is that you need to keep doing what you're doing and not spend too much of your time and energy trying to bring people along to something on which inherently they might not buy into this process. However, find the pieces of this that speak to them. What is the value add for them? And make that clear to them. How does this impact their work? How does this, everyone is searching for a solution, right? That either makes them look good, or helps them with their work or helps them gather greater buy-in. So if you can show those incentive connections for them, that's the most important part. You're also going
Right.
to have like people who are resistant to change, but you cannot drain your organization's resources and time and energy by focusing too much on that. I think that your work will ultimately speak for itself. And that's kind of what you're going to have to focus on.
That's great. Good advice.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last set of advice because we're wrapping up here. Is in 60 seconds, what is your advice to our social innovators on this call who are doing this important work to help them achieve the change they want to see in their communities? So what's your last piece of advice?
Peter, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think to just realize that change is hard and to explain that to everyone along the way. Right? This is, we find the joy where we can in being together and imagining that the change will happen and what it will look like. And to take heart in the fact that one of the reasons that I love theory of change is that with theory of change, any change is mappable. Any change is imaginable, right? There's a pathway to it. Now, that does not mean it's easy. As I've said, it's hard, but we can build pathways to it, and that means it is achievable. And that to me keeps me, getting up in the morning.
That was a tough act to follow, Peter. What I will say is, again, just to reiterate, keep doing what you're doing in a positive way. And then I cannot emphasize enough the importance of working in partnerships. Wherever you're trying to make a difference, there are people there who already understand the problems and the solutions, and you want to find those people, you want to harness the wisdom that's there, and you want to work in collaboration with other people, because none of us as a separate organization can really, I think, make the large scale change we want to see in the world. But the more we can work together and not fall into the trap of competitiveness, the further we'll all get.
Yeah. And I would
Wonderful.
say,
Thank
often
you.
our best allies are the people who we might initially think are, too soured on change or, have checked out. They've checked out because they know that change needs to happen. And they can become your most inspirational partners.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter and Cheri. We appreciate you being here. I know we're finishing up so quickly. We're launching the poll for the session. So we'd love to have your feedback. And Komi, if you could wrap this up as your last session of your time with us here at Catalyst 2030.
Thanks, everybody. So please spend 1 or 2 minutes to tell us how engaging the session is for you. And while you're filling the poll, stay tuned and mark our 2025 learning series. So we designed this series for 2025 based on Catalyst member selections. So you can see here, besides some highly demanded, for example, impact measurement, partnership, and networks, well-being, we also have something new like social media for good and AI for social venture. So stay tuned and register for our 2025 learning series. Also, here I will drop in the chat our Social Change Innovator, a platform created by and for global social innovators to provide you a wealth of knowledge about social entrepreneurship and social innovation. Also, at Catalyst, we have a Medium platform to showcase your system change work. So feel free to check the link and submit your igniting change work with us. And if you haven't been a member of Catalyst, please do so and consider to become a member of Catalyst, one of the fastest growing movements in the world. And finally, as a tradition of Catalyst team, how about turn on your camera, unmute yourself and say thank you in your native language. Thank you.
Shukran. Merci.
Teşekkürler. Görüşürüz.
Aita.
Asante.
Something.
Baika we.
Godlove Sika, Njomi. It means thank you.
Well, thank you.
Wasinja, thank you.